The title is in chronological order, Activism from Vietnam to Palestine. I think it would be useful to switch a little, begin with what's current, then go back to lessons that we can learn from earlier activist struggles from Vietnam through South Africa, East Timor, other cases. The Vietnam War, the beginning of this discussion and of much contemporary activism, was a colossal crime, in my opinion. And I stress in my opinion, anyone considering activism must bear in mind two pretty obvious, sometimes forgotten points. Any choices that we make about engaging in any form of activism, any choices are based, first of all, on value judgments, obviously, and secondly, on judgments about the nature of the circumstances. And both of these can, of course, be contentious, so it's important to be quite clear about them as we proceed. So to begin with Palestine, or to be more accurate, Israel-Palestine, tightly intertwined. I'll begin with something very concrete, actually right now, last week, and ask what it suggests for people who are concerned with the fate of Palestinians and Israelis, and again, very much intertwined. I have in mind the latest report of Human Rights Watch. It came out on April 13th. It's about the West Bank, in particular the Jordan Valley. The focus is on illegal use of Palestinian children in heavy agricultural work in illegal Israeli settlements. If your reading is confined to the U.S. press, you wouldn't know about this. April 13th, I'll read a few quotes. Israeli settlement farms in the West Bank are using Palestinian child labor to grow, harvest, and pack agricultural produce, much of it for export. The farms pay the children low wages, subject them to dangerous working conditions in violation of international standards. Children as young as 11 work on settlement farms, often in high temperatures. The children carry heavy loads, are exposed to hazardous pesticides, in some cases have to pay themselves for medical treatment for work-related injuries or illness. Then come pages and pages of harrowing detail, which I'll skip, and some background. Quoting still, Israel has allocated 86% of the land in the Jordan Valley to settlements and provides vastly greater access to water from the aquifer beneath the valley to the settlement agricultural industry than it does to Palestinians living in the valley. Israeli agricultural settlements export a substantial amount of their produce abroad, including to Europe and the United States. Discriminatory Israeli restrictions on Palestinian access to farmland and water, particularly in the Jordan Valley, traditional center of Palestinian agriculture, that cost the Palestinian economy more than $700 million a year, according to the World Bank. Palestinian poverty rates in the Jordan Valley are up to over 33%, among the highest anywhere in the West Bank. Some Palestinians lease agricultural lands from Israeli settlers, to whom Israel allocated the lands after unlawfully appropriating them from Palestinians. The United States continues to grant preferential treatment to Israeli settlement products under the U.S.-Israel Free Trade Agreement. The U.S. Department of Labor maintains and publishes a list of more than 350 products from foreign countries that are produced with the use of forced labor or child labor in other countries, but has not included Israeli settlement products on the list. Incidentally, Europe and the United States are quite different in this respect. While the United States provides preferential access to these goods and, of course, provides the diplomatic, military, economic means for Israel to continue doing this. The European Union, in contrast, is moving to, and has already started, to restrict settlement products. Now, that's aroused a great fury in Israel. It's denounced as anti-Semitism. Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman really said it amounts to putting a yellow star on products from Israel, and therefore a proof of inveterate European anti-Semitism. Finally, this HRW report was covered in the mainstream British press, Australian press, and elsewhere, and it's on the wire services, which means that every newsroom and editorial office knows all about it, but not a word seems to have appeared in the U.S. press. Well, that raises questions for activists. The first question is whether the facts are right. You can check them. It's possible. I don't see any reason to question them. And there's more to say about them. The Jordan Valley is about a third of arable land in the West Bank. Israel has been slowly taking it over in a classic manner, actually goes back a century, establishing military zones, or sometimes green zones, in which all settlement is excluded, and then after the Palestinians are kicked out, slowly introducing Israeli settlements, driving the Palestinians out of their lands, sinking wells, and so on. If it's reached 86%, as they say, it's a matter of quite extreme importance. Take a look at a map, you can see that the Jordan Valley, big part of the West Bank, essentially imprisons everything that's left. That's its central significance. Well, then there are value judgments. Those are the questions of fact. Then come the value judgments. Should we be concerned, we, I mean you and me, that we are providing crucial support for the practices described? And should we be concerned that what we proudly call the free press is keeping it silent? Well, that's for people to decide for themselves. If we should be concerned, then there are some pretty clear conclusions for those who care about the fate of Palestinians and Israelis. For Palestinians, it's obvious without discussion. Apart from the criminality of everything described, it's part of the systematic, careful, planned destruction of any hopes that Palestinians might have for a decent existence. The consequences for Israel may be a little less directly obvious, but they're quite serious. It's important to remember that 40 years ago, Israel was one of the most admired countries in the world. Now it's one of the most feared and hated countries in the world. That's shown very clearly in international polls, incidentally, including in Europe. It's not anti-Semitism, as is standardly claimed. Anti-Semitism is no different now from what it was 40 years ago. It's simply a reaction to Israeli policies. And those who support those policies should recognize what they're supporting for Israel. A reaction of Israeli policies which have been vicious, brutal, and criminal, an explicit violation of international law, as determined repeatedly by the highest international authorities, United Nations Security Council, International Court of Justice, World Court, all relevant international organizations. That includes everything since 1968, beginning with the effective annexation of Jerusalem in 1968 in violation of Security Council orders, including the United States at that time, and all settlement and development activities in the occupied territories, in particular the Jordan Valley, which again is of crucial importance, not only because of its scale and its significance for agriculture and production, but also because it imprisons everything that's left. I'll come back to that. Well, I'm not going to try to review this record. That's not our topic today, but I do want to mention a few highlights that seem to me at least of particular significance. The first is 1971. In February 1971, Israel faced a fateful choice. Does it want security or does it want expansion? It was a very clear choice. President Sadat of Egypt, February 1971, offered Israel a full peace treaty in return for, with normalization of relations and so on, in return for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, and was quite clear, he made it pretty clear that what he meant was the Egyptian Sinai. Egypt, of course, is the major Arab state. If Israel has a peace treaty with with Egypt, the security issues are over. Israel considered the offer, and the cabinet decided to reject it. They were at the time planning extensive development projects in the Egyptian Sinai, going to build a big city, Yamit, all-Jewish city on the Mediterranean, dozens of settlements, kibbutzim, Bedouins were being driven out of their lands and so on, villages and mosques, cemeteries destroyed, big project. And they decided to choose expansion rather than security. The crucial question, as always, is what the United States will do. It was debated in the United States. There was a division of opinion. Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor, won out in the debate. His position, as he explained, was stalemate, no negotiations, just force. And force, it looked like, was totally on Israel's side. So therefore, the United States backed it against the advice of the State Department. That's 1971. That was the immediate background for the 1973 war, a major war, very close call for Israel, in fact, for the world. Kissinger at one point called a high-level nuclear alert. Reasons were not known at the time. They are known thanks to recently declassified documents. Israel and Russia, the United States and Russia, had agreed on a ceasefire, and they imposed a ceasefire on the warring parties. But Kissinger privately informed Prime Minister Golda Meir of Israel that they could disregard the ceasefire and keep fighting. They had encircled the Egyptian army, so they did. And of course, the Russians knew about this, and the nuclear alert was called to warn the Russians not to interfere with what Kissinger calls his delicate diplomacy, designed to ensure an Israeli victory, but not too great a victory, because he wanted the United States to keep in control of the region, nobody else allowed to enter. Came close, could have been a world war, terminal world war, but that's delicate diplomacy. That's 1973. At that point, Israel and the United States realized that they could not simply disregard Egypt. It wasn't a basket case. And Kissinger started his so-called shuttle diplomacy, ended up in Camp David in 1978-79. A peace treaty was signed. Israel and the U.S. agreed to a settlement that was worse from their point of view than the one they rejected in 1971. Because there was some recognition of Palestinian rights, at least in theory, which had not been true in 71. In U.S. scholarship and media, this is called a great triumph of American diplomacy. In fact, it's a total catastrophe of American diplomacy, but that's the way these things work. Well, meanwhile, other things were happening. In 1976, January 1976, a resolution was brought to the United Nations Security Council calling for a diplomatic settlement, Israel-Palestine, a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border with, now quoting, guarantees for the right of each state to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. The states that brought the resolution were Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, three major Arab states. Israel refused to attend the session. The United States vetoed the resolution. A U.S. veto, remember, is a double veto. Nothing happens, and it's wiped out of history. So you have to work to find it, but it's there. Another similar resolution was vetoed by the United States under Carter in 1980. That what was proposed in that resolution by the three Arab states is essentially what is now a total international consensus, called a two-state settlement. Various modifications can be considered, many further details to be worked out, but that's the basic framework. It's accepted by everyone. The Arab states, Organization of Islamic States, includes Iran, Europe, Latin America, everybody, except the two countries that count. Israel rejects it, the United States rejects it. That's 40 years of U.S. rejectionism, which have blocked a diplomatic settlement approved by the whole world. It's not the way it's presented here, so you have to think about whether it's true, but I think if you look at it, you'll find it's true. There's much more to say about the United Nations. The latest U.S. veto at the Security Council was February 2011. That's Obama. It was usually these never get reported, but this was surprising enough so that there was a little reporting about it. Obama vetoed a resolution calling for implementation of official U.S. policy. Official U.S. policy is that the settlements should not expand. Okay? It's a very minor issue. The problem is not expansion of the settlements, it's the settlements, all illegal. But the U.S. says settlement expansion is not helpful, you shouldn't do it. And that's what the resolution called for, an end to settlement expansion. Obama vetoed it. That, as I said, did get a little notice. Well, without proceeding with this, the question is whether this record, which you can easily discover for yourselves, plenty in print, whether it should inspire some kind of activism, particularly within the country that's directly responsible. It's worth remembering that simply because of obvious reasons of relative power, Israel can essentially do nothing unless it's authorized by the United States. By now, Israel is so isolated that it has no other support, and that's what the United States permits that Israel can do. When the United States lays down the law, as it repeatedly does, Israel's compelled to obey. That's for obvious power reasons. So the usual questions arise here. The questions of fact, I've mentioned a few, but of course there's a lot more. And the question of values, do we care? That's for individual American citizens to decide. What's involved is not just the West Bank. It also includes the annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights, again in violation of explicit Security Council orders, and the shocking crimes in Gaza. Those are so awful that I want to say at least a word about them. Long history, but I'll start in 2005 when an event took place that's called the Israeli disengagement from Gaza. Now, that's portrayed in Israeli propaganda and U.S. media as a noble act, which Palestinians had a chance to build Switzerland, but they decided to turn to terror, so everything turned awful. The facts are a little bit different, as you can easily discover, and they're also very clear and explicit. They were explained right away by the top Israeli official who was responsible for the negotiations, for the disengagement, so-called, Dov Weissglass, an close associate of Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was in charge of the negotiations and implementation of the disengagement. And he explained right away what it's about to the Israeli press. I'll quote, "The significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. And when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent a discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package, called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed indefinitely from our agenda." Now, that's what the disengagement was about. Now, the reason for it was pretty obvious. Israeli hawks came to understand that Gaza had already been virtually destroyed, and it didn't make much sense for a huge part of the Israeli army to be in Gaza protecting a few thousand illegal settlers who had taken over a substantial part of the scarce land and resources. And they made the rational decision to transfer these settlers from their illegal subsidized homes in Gaza to illegal subsidized homes in the West Bank, which Israel intended to keep. That was the noble gesture. The purpose of it was exactly as described by the high official in charge. Well, the occupation, of course, continues. That's recognized by every relevant authority. Even the United States recognizes that Gaza is still occupied territories. Israel is alone in denying this. One of the many elements of the international isolation that Israel has chosen consciously as part of its preference for expansion over security. In November 2005, as the disengagement was implemented, an agreement was signed. It's called the Agreement on Movement and Access, signed by Israel and Palestine. It's the first of many such agreements and the model for others. The basic wording keeps being repeated. It called for a crossing between Gaza and Israel and Egypt for export of goods, transit of people, bus and truck convoys between the West Bank and Gaza, the building of a seaport in Gaza, reopening of the airport in Gaza that Israeli bombing had demolished. Those are the terms of the agreement. As I say, they're repeated over and over in following years. You may remember the Oslo agreements 20 years ago, which one of their crucial points was that the West Bank and Gaza are a single, indivisible territorial unity. They're the same, they're together, they must be combined. That's crucial to the Oslo agreement. Right away, the United States and Israel moved to separate the two and have continued to prevent them from being linked in any way. The reasons for that are pretty obvious when you look at a map again. Gaza is the only access of Palestinians to the outside world. The West Bank is completely enclosed. Israel on one side, Jordan, U.S.-Israeli ally, on the other side. And of course, the taking over the Jordan Valley just intensifies the imprisonment. So if Gaza is separated from the West Bank, as the U.S. and Israel determined 20 years ago, then any Palestinian entity that ever arises will be completely imprisoned. No access to the outside world, okay? That's obvious from simply looking at a map. Well, that was the agreement of November 2005. Now, that agreement lasted a few weeks. It broke down in January, not because of Hamas rockets. There was not a single Hamas rocket or any other provocation. It broke down because Palestinians committed a real crime in January 2006. There were elections, free elections, internationally monitored, recognized to be free and fair, but they had a major flaw. Palestinians voted the wrong way. Hamas won the plurality, was able to take over the parliament. There are few greater crimes than voting the wrong way in a free election. That requires punishment. And what happened illustrates very clearly the U.S. concept of what free elections are. The U.S. immediately imposed harsh sanctions. Israel stepped up the siege, more sanctions, stepped up its violence. Palestinians had to be taught a lesson. You don't commit crimes like voting the wrong way in a free election. The United States immediately began the usual procedure, began to organize a military coup to overthrow the elected government. A couple of months later, a year later, Hamas preempted the coup, undermined it. That's a still worse crime. It's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election. To undermine a military coup that the U.S. is organizing to overthrow the government, that's pretty far out. So the sanctions, the siege, the violence all were sharply intensified. In the West, in the United States, that's called Hamas's violent takeover of the West Bank, of the Gaza Strip, which is not totally false, but a little bit left out. Well, so it continues. I won't go through the details, but there is a definite pattern since November 2005 right to the present. An agreement is reached, like the agreement on movement and access. Israel completely disregards it, violates it, maintains the siege, maintains violence. Hamas adheres to it fully, as Israel formally recognizes, until some escalation of Israeli violence leads to a Hamas response, at which point there's another exercise of what Israel delicately calls mowing the lawn. Go in and smash the place up. Then a ceasefire is agreed and the same pattern is repeated. I won't run through the details, but you can easily verify it if you like. That continues right to the present. The record is very clear. Israel is shielded by U.S. propaganda and media complicity, but it's not difficult to break. The facts are very clear. You can find them without any trouble. Each Israeli attack is more vicious and destructive than the last. The worst one yet was last summer. Gaza's utterly in ruins. It's a hapless victim of U.S.-Israeli violence, which raises the same questions. One, the question, are these the facts? Well, you're college students, you can do the research, figure it out. It's not very hard. And the second is, do we care about our crimes? That's the value judgment. Well, again, the impact on Palestinians is devastating, harmful to Israel as well. Again, in the early 70s, Israel was one of the most admired and respected countries in the world until it made its fateful decision to prefer expansion, criminal expansion, to security. And the consequences are clear. It was clear at the time. It was clear that people who called themselves supporters of Israel were in fact supporting its moral degeneration, its increasing isolation, and its possible ultimate destruction, which is what the likely consequence of such policies are. That's what's called support for Israel. That's clear in the record. You can think it through. Well, let's turn to some of the precedents, and in fact begin with a fairly similar situation, South Africa. Now, there are many analogies drawn between South Africa and Israel-Palestine. Most of them, I think, are very weak and dubious. I don't think they can be sustained. One is the use of the term apartheid for Israel-Palestine. I don't think that's correct, and I don't think it's a useful term. With regard to Israel itself, there is discrimination, and it's pretty severe in some ways, but it's nothing like apartheid. It doesn't even come close. In the occupied territories, in contrast, it's far worse than apartheid. It's a gift to Israel to call it apartheid. Remember that apartheid South Africa needed its black population. That was 85% of the population. That was the workforce. They had to care for them to make sure they were making out reasonably well. South Africa tried hard to develop the Bantustans to which they were confined, tried to get international recognition for them. Treated miserably, of course, utterly brutal and horrendous, but there was a certain amount of care for them. They're kind of like slave owners, have to care for the slaves, their capital. You have to make sure it stays, That's why slave owners, in fact, after Reconstruction in the United States, turned to a new form of slavery, which was much more efficient, namely criminalization. If the especially the black male population is imprisoned, as was done systematically after 1875, then employers get a perfect workforce. The state has to provide for them, They can't protest, of course can't unionize, can't do anything. They just are perfect slaves. And that's the way much of U.S. industrial development took place, in fact, as late as the Second World War, and we're seeing a repetition of it right now. But in any event, in South Africa, the white apartheid state had to care for its black population to some extent. That's totally different in the West Bank, in the occupied territories. Israel simply doesn't want the Palestinians. Be perfectly happy if they leave. They can live under conditions as miserable as it turns out to be. It's essentially none of their business. That's a totally different situation and much worse than apartheid. So I don't think the apartheid analogy is an accurate one. There is, however, one accurate analogy between Israel and South Africa, and a very revealing one, I think. It's never discussed, but I think it's quite significant. When the apartheid regime was basically instituted formally in late 1950s, the South African nationalists recognized what was going to happen. We know from declassified documents that the South African foreign minister called in the U.S. ambassador and spoke to him about what was happening. He said, "We understand that we're going to become a pariah state. Everyone will vote against us in the United Nations. We'll be subject to various sanctions of one kind or another." But he said, none of this really matters, because there's only one vote in the United Nations. That's yours. There's only one country that matters, namely the country that runs the world. That's you. It's put a little differently. The way he said it is, you're in charge of the free world. That translates as saying you're the godfather, and you ensure that everyone follows orders. That's pretty much what happened. The United States, South Africa did, of course, become a pariah state. Substantial protests developed in the 60s and 70s. The United States was a kind of latecomer, but by the 1980s, there were quite substantial protest movements here. Congress was passing sanctions, which President Reagan had to veto, and if they were passed over his veto, he violated them anyway. Reagan was an extreme racist in many respects, including South Africa. He was never even willing to concede that there was an apartheid in South Africa. He described it as a tribal war. The Bantus, the Zulus, the whites, they're all fighting each other, but no apartheid. And right through the Reagan years, the United States continued to support South Africa. Also to support South Africa's depredations in the surrounding countries. South Africa was trying to construct a regional system by violence in Angola, Mozambique, illegally occupied Namibia, in which they'd be protected by a ring of supportive client states. And the U.S. was directly involved in this. Finally, around 1990, the U.S. did change its position, stopped support for... The U.S. was alone at that point. Even Thatcher's England had backed off. Israel was still supporting it, but aside from that, nobody. Finally, the U.S. changed its position. Very quickly, apartheid collapsed. Now, it wasn't only because of the U.S. change in position. That was a significant element, but not the only one. A very significant element, which you're not supposed to talk about in the United States, is Cuba. Cuba sent military forces, actually black soldiers, which was crucial, which drove South Africa out of Angola, compelled South Africa to give up its illegal control over Namibia, and made it very clear to South Africa that they were not going to be able to establish this surrounding periphery of client states. That also had a big psychological effect, both in white South Africa and black South Africa. As I said, these were black soldiers defeating the allegedly, invulnerable, colossal white mercenaries. That broke down all sorts of effects. South Africa did pull out. The United States actually continued to support the terrorist armies in Angola, even after South Africa stopped supporting them. But that was a major effect on the end of apartheid, in fact, the liberation of Africa. And the Africans know it. When Nelson Mandela was released from prison finally, one of his first acts was to thank Fidel Castro for the tremendous contribution that Cuba had made to the liberation of Africa. If you go to the Pretoria, the monument where there's names of people who died in the struggle, lots of Cubans, nobody else. And it's particularly remarkable because Cuba never took credit for it, never. They wanted the credit to be for the Black African liberation groups. It's a pretty amazing example of altruistic internationalism. It's well described in scholarship. There's nothing comparable to it that I know. But it was a major effect. There was another factor, too. In the case of South Africa, there was a solution which was acceptable to the international business community, the U.S. business community, and to the wealthy South Africans. The solution was to end apartheid, but to keep the institutions in place. So there could be some black faces in the limousines, but essentially keep the same socioeconomic system in place. That was an acceptable solution, so it could be reached. These are differences to Israel-Palestine, but there is one crucial similarity: U.S. support. As long as U.S. support continues, there's no particular reason to expect Israel to change the policies it's now pursuing. Well, let's go back to Vietnam. As Gordon mentioned in Kissinger's announcement, he's talked about the end of the 14-year alliance. That's back to 1961. And in fact, in 1961, 62, Kennedy came in and very sharply escalated the U.S. attack against South Vietnam, which had been going on for 6 years. Kennedy ordered the U.S. Air Force to carry out bombing missions in South Vietnam. They were carrying out maybe a third of the bombing missions under South Vietnamese markings, but that didn't fool anybody. He authorized the use of napalm, began, crucially, chemical warfare to destroy crops and livestock. That ended up with a huge atrocity still continuing, massive poisoning of South Vietnamese. One of the agents they were using contained dioxin, one of the worst carcinogens known to this day. Genetic malformation is common among South Vietnamese babies, not North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese babies, and so on. It goes on right to the present. And he also initiated the programs to drive peasants into what amounted to concentration camps called strategic hamlets, in which they were surrounded by barbed wire and, as we put it, protected from the guerrillas who the U.S. knew that they were voluntarily supporting. Now, that all began in the early 60s. No protest here. I remember I was trying to, just personally, I was giving talks, but it would be a talk in somebody's living room to a couple of neighbors, or a church with 3 or 4 people or something like that. And since there was no protest, it just escalated. By 1965, South Vietnam had been very seriously devastated. By then, protest was barely beginning. Just keep to Boston right here. Some of your older people will remember. In October 1965, there was an International Day of Protest called Protest Against the War in Vietnam. So we thought here that we could try to organize our first outdoor demonstration on the Boston Common, standard place for public protest. And there was a demonstration, sort of, except that it was violently broken up, often by a lot of students, incidentally, marching in from the colleges and other counter demonstrators. They were I was supposed to be one of the speakers. Nobody could hear a speaker. That was impossible. The only reason there wasn't real people killed where there were hundreds of state police around. They didn't like what we were doing, but they didn't want people to be murdered on the Boston Common. The Boston Globe, if you take a look at it the next day, was full of condemnations, bitter condemnations of the demonstrators. How dare you call for the end of the bombing of North Vietnam? That's unpatriotic, and so on and so forth. Well, the next International Day of Protest was in March 1966. We realized we couldn't have a public demonstration in Boston, so it was in a church, Arlington Street Church. That was attacked. Tin cans, tomatoes, so on, defaced. Finally, after that, by 1967, a substantial protest movement had developed with an important resistance element, very significant, young people refusing to serve in the war. At that point, but you have to remember what was going on by then in Vietnam. Remember, the worst attack was against South Vietnam. They were the targets. Bernard Fall, who was the recognized expert, the one expert recognized by the U.S. government, wrote at that time that he doubted that South Vietnam could even survive as a historical, cultural entity under the attack of the most extraordinary military machine that had ever been launched against an area this size. By then there was protest. January 1968, the Tet Offensive took place in South Vietnam. That was a remarkable event, historically unprecedented. There was a huge uprising all over the country simultaneously. And what made it amazing is that the occupiers didn't know it. The country had over 500,000 American troops. The Saigon Army, Client Army, was almost 1 million people. Every village was infiltrated. But nobody talked. The revolt uprising took place, took everyone by surprise, practically took over the country, broke into the American embassy, a huge violence that finally succeeded in repressing it. But it did convince the American business community that the promises that the war was going to end soon were false, that this was going to be a long, drawn-out war. And a large part of the business community turned against the war. They said, look, it's not worth it. We've already destroyed Vietnam. There's no point in facing the costs of continuing this. The President Johnson, wanted to send a couple 100,000 more troops to Vietnam. If you take a look at the Pentagon Papers, the last part of the Pentagon Papers, it ends in mid-68, deal with this situation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were opposed to sending more troops because they said that if they did, they would need troops here in the United States for civil disorder control because the population was getting out of control. Young people, women, minorities, students, there's just going to be an uprising, and we have to have the troops here to control it. Well, that's a contribution of the activism of those years. It was belated, but it built up to a point where the Pentagon understood this country's going out of control. We're not going to be able to control it without force if we continue this. The business community began to be opposed for similar reasons. They realized that the country is falling apart. They don't want that. So there was a decline in the attack. Horrible years followed. I won't run through it, but it did finally end 7 years later. Well, that's a significant contribution of large-scale dedicated activism. Very late, but important when it happened. Now, at the end of the war, 1975, there were, of course, evaluations of what happened, and they're very interesting to read. Probably the most critical voice in the mainstream American media was Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, a strong liberal, civil libertarian, strong opponent of the war. He wrote a column about the war. He said, "The war began with blundering efforts to do good." That's by definition, if we did it, it's to do good. blundering because it didn't work. Began with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969, it was clear that it was a disaster. We could not bring to South Vietnam the kind of regime we wanted at a cost acceptable to ourselves. So the war was really bad. That's the extreme criticism within the mainstream intellectual community. Actually, that continues until today. So, for example, Obama is praised for being an opponent of the Iraq War. What he actually said is it's a strategic blunder. We shouldn't do stupid things. If you read Pravda in the early 1980s, Russian generals were criticizing the Afghan invasion in the same terms. They said, look, this is stupid. We shouldn't be doing it. You go back to Nazi Germany, there were Nazi generals who were condemning Hitler's two-front war. It's dumb. We should knock out the British first. We don't regard them as moral heroes. But since the harshest criticism that can be voiced about ourselves is we made a mistake, that's considered moral heroism here, continues right to the present. Well, meanwhile, there were polls taken of the public. What was public opinion? Turns out for many years then and many years following, about 2/3, 70% of the American public said the war was not a mistake. It was fundamentally wrong and immoral. Well, nobody inquired further to see just what that means because the idea is so outlandish, but that was a large majority of the public, not elite sectors, not liberal intellectuals, not scholarship. Well, let's go on a couple of years. In early 1981, Reagan decided to launch a major war against Central America. The early steps that the Reagan administration took duplicated almost point by point what Kennedy had done in South Vietnam. Kennedy was the model. Came out with a State Department white paper about all the horrible things the communists are doing, propaganda about the Russians coming, and the whole routine. But they had to back off because there was an immediate public uproar about it, not like 1961. So they backed off, pulled back. There was never an invasion of Central America. What happened was horrible enough. I won't go through it, but hundreds of thousands of people were killed, millions of refugees, every imaginable kind of torture. The country's ruined. One of the main reasons why we still have, for the so-called immigration crisis. But it wasn't like Vietnam, nothing like Vietnam. Well, again, that's a contribution of activism. Let's turn to 1999, East Timor, which Gordon mentioned. In September 1999, President Clinton quietly informed the Indonesians that the game was over and they had to leave East Timor. Again, when the Mafia Don gives orders, others obey. What had happened? 25 years earlier, Indonesia had invaded the former Portuguese colony of East Timor with strong U.S. support all the way through. It was devastating. It was virtually genocidal, maybe a quarter, a third of the population killed. One of the worst atrocities of the period. Very little protest here. The U.S. and its allies, too, incidentally, were able to support it. Slowly, protest developed. Activist groups began to form. By 1999, there was a sharp escalation of Indonesian atrocities, and then there was protest, international and domestic. And under extensive domestic and international protest, Clinton said it's over. And the Indonesian army left. What remained has become a very poor but at least independent country. The way that's treated in U.S. Kind of literature, scholarship, and so on, is that we made a mistake. So Samantha Power, in her famous book, Problem from Hell, which is devoted to our failure to do anything about the crimes of others, always ignoring our own crimes. What she says is the United States looked away from East Timor. That was terrible. And we didn't look away. The U.S. looked right there, provided the authorization for the attack, sent the arms, gave all the diplomatic support for it. But the most you can say is we looked away. Bad mistake on our part. Well, in any event, protest and activism did finally have an effect. Let's go on to 2003, the invasion of Iraq, the worst crime of this millennium. This is the first time in the history of imperialism that there was a major protest against the invasion, against the aggression, before it took place. That's pretty remarkable. Those of you who were around then will remember big protests in Boston the day before the invasion. My classes at MIT insisted on canceling the class because they wanted to take part in the protests. That's the day before the invasion, not 6 years later. It had an effect. What happened in Iraq is horrendous. There was just a report that came out by International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, Nobel laureate winning organization, and Physicians for Social Responsibility, a detailed study of casualties. They assume at a minimum about 1 million deaths, maybe more. There are millions of refugees, millions, literally, displaced people. The invasion incited a sectarian conflict which didn't exist before, which is now tearing the country and the region apart. So it was pretty awful, but it was not Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, which are in a class by themselves. Well, that shows you that activism can have an effect. Well, about all these things, the facts are hardly in doubt. You can check them. The real question is, what are our values? Final remark about Israel-Palestine. Right now, there are two options. One option is the two-state settlement, which is supported by the whole world, except us and Israel. And the second option is that Israel continue doing exactly what it's doing with U.S. support. What it's doing is perfectly clear, separating Gaza from the West Bank, taking over the Jordan Valley, maybe a third of the area, crucial third, taking over what's called Jerusalem, which Israel essentially annexed. It's 5 times the size of anything that was ever Jerusalem. It includes lots of surrounding Arab villages, corridor to the east of Jerusalem, extending, essentially bisecting the West Bank, including the town of Ma'ale Adumim, built mostly during the Clinton years with the purpose of bisecting the West Bank. A couple of corridors to the north, all the territory within the so-called the separation wall, which is in fact an annexation wall. These territories that Israel's taking over slowly and integrating Israel with big infrastructure projects and so on, they are not going to contain very many Palestinians. The Palestinians who are there are mostly being driven out, and they avoid the heavy Palestinian population concentrations. So as this gets integrated into a greater Israel, it is not going to create what is called the demographic problem, grim problem. Too many non-Jews in a Jewish state. It's not going to increase that problem. In fact, it will probably decrease it if you look at the demography. Now, that's the alternative to a two-state settlement. Now, there is talk about a one-state settlement. That's become kind of popular among solidarity activists and others. The argument is, since we can't achieve a two-state settlement with virtually unanimous international support, let's achieve a one-state settlement with no international support. That's essentially the argument. In particular, no support at all from the U.S. and Israel, or from other countries, because for U.S. and Israel is a preferable alternative. Just continue what you're doing. Much preferable. A one-state settlement would raise the demographic problem. Why should they face it? Just slowly expel the Palestinians make life impossible for those who are left, gradually expand the way you are in the Jordan Valley, no objections. That's what's very likely to happen as long as the U.S. continues to support it, as in other cases. And it will continue, I think, unless U.S. policy changes, which could happen. It's happened in the past. I mentioned a number of cases. But it won't happen without substantial, active, popular mobilization and activism. And it's up to those who are willing to dedicate themselves to serious activism to determine which of these outcomes is going to take place.